Glenn Sommerville is here. He joins us today from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. He is the co founder and managing director of High Performance Leaders, Inc., HPL for short. HPL was created to reinvent the way leaders are developed. Through deliberate practice, HPL develops the skills and essential habits a leader needs to create alignment between the leaders of an organization, the management systems, and the organization's culture. Glenn has served in various senior leadership roles for major companies, including Honeywell, Toyota, BlackBerry, and Amazon, including responsibility for Amazon fulfillment operations across Canada. We're excited to have Glenn with us today to discuss leadership development, strategies for managing the stress of an executive role, and to share observations on how to work across generations in a rapidly changing global workforce. Glenn, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Brian. It's nice to be here.
So let's begin with a little bit about your journey. You've built clearly a strong career in the corporate world, acquiring a lot of leadership skills, ever more responsibilities, building your resume. What made you decide to step back from that form of leadership to start your own consulting practice to help others?
Yeah, great question, Brian. I guess it was a number of things. But for the most part, I think I had a proven track record of being able to run a large organization, scale an organization. But what really got me up in the morning was working with other leaders, helping people develop, coaching them, and helping them achieve what they want to achieve in their careers. And I really get excited about that and look for more opportunities to do so.
So, one of the interesting topics that is recurring over and over again, whether it's large companies or smaller businesses or even family owned businesses, is what's I think commonly referred to as a leadership gap. You have a baby boomer generation, as we refer to them in the States, that's leaving the workforce without necessarily an experienced generation. Able or willing to take over for them. Do you feel that that is a hesitation from maybe kids who've watched their parents go through the trials and tribulations of leadership and they're scared by it, or do you feel this is a true skill gap that they're simply not learning the skills on the job to be able to take on these increased roles of responsibility?
I absolutely agree with your synopsis there, Brian. I call it the leadership crisis, actually. I don't believe that it's that leaders aren't willing to step up. I think there's a large number of leaders that are wanting to move into higher level positions. I think the issue is more so along the lines of they don't have the experience. As you mentioned yourselves, the they're getting themselves into these positions at a younger age, higher level positions, and they just don't have the support that I had, for example, when I was coming up through the ranks. And so they want to do well. They want to be the best leaders that they can. They're just not getting enough experience and enough coaching.
What do you think companies need to do? I see so many large companies try to implement leadership programs, and they seem light. I'll be honest, from what I have seen, they're very sort of 4 hour or 8 hour courses during a workday. They're special aside from your normal role. I'm not seeing as many apprenticeship style programs. Tell me what you think the best model is. If you're a company trying to shape the future leaders, it has to be part of the routine daily work. I don't feel like it can just be these one offs that you do at an offsite once a quarter.
I think it's a combination of things. First and foremost, I believe there needs to be a formal mentoring or coaching relationship with other leaders within the organization. One of the things I see very, very frequently from the leaders that I coach is they just don't get that kind of support in their organizations. I don't think it's a case that the other leaders don't want to. It's just a case of bandwidth. They just don't have the bandwidth to spend with these younger leaders coming up through the ranks. So that would be number one, establishing a coaching and a mentoring relationship for the leaders coming up. Uh, Coupled with, there is a need for some formal leadership development programs, if you will. Like you, I agree, they're a small percentage of what needs to happen. And in those cases, they need to be practical. They need to be able to learn the concepts and then quickly apply them within their regular responsibilities so that they become habits and become the way, the process, and the methods that they use throughout their leadership on a daily basis. And then third is just the overall experience. Again, when I look back over my career, Where I absolutely learned the most is when I had the biggest challenges. When I my wife kind of laughs at me to this day, where I would come home and say, I think I'm going to get fired. I don't know what I'm doing. And she would always say to me, maybe you don't know what you're doing, but you're going to figure it out. And I always did. And I have no regrets in any of those situations. So I think it's a combination of those three things, depending on the individual and what level of experience that they have.
Do you feel any of this is societal in nature? I feel like there has been a breakdown to some degree of the mentorship model, of the apprenticeship model, that we used to just be inherent in communities. It was a given that the sort of the elders of the community, if we want to use an older term, and the junior members would spend more time together, and there was a natural sharing of life skills and experiences, and then that naturally occurred within a workplace environment. Do you feel like some of what we're seeing today is just a symptom of a larger issue in society seeping into workplaces?
I haven't really looked at it that way, Brian, to be honest with you. I can see aspects of that. I look at it more along the lines of people are just too busy. Phrase I like to use is they're busy being busy. They're focused on their own things. I don't think it's a deliberate, hesitation or shying away from that responsibility. I think all leaders, doesn't matter what level of experience they have, are seem to be overwhelmed. I think it has gotten worse since the whole COVID situation, for sure. I think a lot of coaching and engagement directly with their subordinates has decreased throughout the COVID situation because everybody was virtual. Now that we're getting back into the workplaces, I see signs that that is getting better. I'm getting more people asking questions about how they can better engage and coach their teams. So I hope we're seeing a change to that. We're a little bit late though because of this leadership crisis or the leadership gap, as you refer to it. And there's a lot of catching up to be done. But I don't really think it's society as a whole. I think it's more of the situations that people are finding themselves in.
So let's talk about the busy being busy part, because if there's one complaint we hear chronically, whether it's small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, it is just the amount of what you'll hear often is, well, there's so many things I have to get back to. There's the paperwork and there's email responses, and I have my daily meetings. And because my team is remote, I have to spend more time on the conference calls with them. Some of that's true. Some of it might be a little overdone. Where are you seeing people in leadership roles or aspiring to leadership roles wasting time?
Well, first, let me say, completely agree. This is something that really concerns me and is actually a real pet peeve of mine, if I may say it that way. I think many leaders are overwhelmed, but they're their own worst enemies. They're not helping themselves. What I see is they're afraid to say no. They just keep taking on more and more, and a lot of this is what I would refer to as busy work. It's not really value added. It's not focusing on their priorities. And so I think better decision making as to what are their major priorities, what are the things that are going to move the needle, move the ball forward, if you will. They need to make those decisions. And they have to get comfortable saying no or pushing back. At the very least, to be able to say, where does this shake out in my priorities? Does this change my priorities in any way? When do you actually need this to be done? So I think there's many things that they can do themselves to, number one, establish their priorities, but then also manage any changing priorities as they come up.
When you think about the meeting conundrum, because I think in a modern environment where large companies especially have people distributed around the world, the Zoom meeting is sort of an inevitable piece. Having weekly touch bases on topics is inevitable. Some you control, some others control. But this is also an area where people can say no, and be a little more clear in where they need to be and where they can delegate or where they simply do not add value and they can step away from that. What are some of the criteria that you think about as a leader about the meetings that you must attend, the sort of if I have time I'll join, and then the ones you just straight up say no to?
Well, I use exactly that criteria. Anytime a meeting comes in, I've always looked at it this way. I do that evaluation. Is this a priority to me? Am I adding value by attending that? how many others on my team are attending this meeting? Do we all need to attend, or can somebody else go? And then the ones, why am I even being invited? And so I look at that from that evaluation standpoint and make decisions, one off decisions based on every meeting that comes in. Again, I think it's a getting comfortable with, you don't have to know everything. You need to, actually, a phrase that I often use with leaders is, you need to be very selfish when it comes to your own time, and really look at it. This meeting is an hour out of my life, not just it's an hour meeting, it's an hour out of my life. Is this the best use of that hour? If it's not, then what do you do? Now, I'm very particular on, you need to be professional. So to your point, Brian, if I'm going to delegate this meeting, then there's a certain responsibility that needs to take place, which is inform the person you're delegating to, what is the meeting about, why are you delegating it to them. And I believe that you delegate to elevate. In other words, delegate to somebody who's going to learn and develop and grow as a result of attending that meeting, not just saving you from attending that meeting, but meeting with them in advance, making sure they're set up for success, making sure they know what to expect and they're comfortable attending that meeting. And if not, help them get comfortable. Let the people know that you're sending a delegate on your behalf, and then follow up afterwards to make sure. So, what took place at the meeting? Were there any actions I need to know about? Anything I need to assist you with, etc. As far as the less important meetings, decline them. There's nothing worse than scheduling a meeting and expecting 20 people and two people show up because another 18 decided they're not going to come. So let the person who sent the invite to you know that you're not planning to attend or send a delegate. I think that's only a professional courtesy to pay to people.
As young leaders are setting up their companies for the first time, the entrepreneurial types in the startup environment, let's say, one of the conversations that's been taking place is about the advantages of remote work versus in person. And in particular, the core leadership team. I think it's a given that sometimes you need a design talent or a particular skill that is just not available in your local market. You're probably going to need to bring that in from elsewhere. But then there's a discussion about your core leadership team, maybe the 4 or 5 of you who are the founder and their chief executives, and the benefits of being in person, all in the same location geographically, whether you get together 5 days a week or not, knowing you have that. If you were setting up your company for the first time, would you prioritize having your leaders all in the same geographic location to get the benefit of that in person time?
Yes, absolutely. As much as possible, and wherever that makes the most sense. It's not always possible, as you said, but absolutely. I don't think there's anything better than face to face, communication, body language, just the hallway corridor conversations that take place. So absolutely. When I look back when I started my business with my partner, we spent many a days, many hours just sitting together, talking, strategizing, and working through. I believe there's a lot of things you can do virtually for sure, but being face to face helps formulate the culture of the organization, which you can do part of that virtually, but not 100%.
And then to dovetail on the topic of culture, especially, so many leaders are coming into situations where there needs to be a turnaround. Part of the reason they've been brought in is because the culture has taken a turn for the worse, and it's a big project to try to get things moving in the right direction. Can you give some advice to our listeners who are in that position where they've been given a leadership position, but it's very much a turnaround project, and culture is the core challenge? What do you think is the best place to start? And what are some of the key decisions that need to be made in those first couple of weeks when you're in the chair to determine whether you're going to have a successful turnaround or not?
Sure. I think the most important thing is to get into the organization physically. Go to where the people are working, talk to them, understand what their challenges are, what their frustrations are. One of my favorite questions to ask in an organization on an individual basis is what's frustrating you today? Powerful, powerful question, and it really, people really unload and let you know what's on their mind. And when you do that with a number of people, it starts to paint a picture as to what are the cultural barriers or cultural challenges that the organization is facing. So I think the most important thing, you're not going to solve it from your office, you're not going to solve it from the conference room. You got to get out face to face, talk to people, and ask those simple questions. They're not loaded questions either. So if you think about it, what's your biggest frustration? You have no idea what they're going to say, and you're not painting or leading them a certain way, but you get some very valuable information when you do that. The second piece that comes with that is, when they mention what is their frustration or what are some of the challenges that they're facing, the barriers that they're needing help overcoming, go and see those. So show me that. Why is this a challenge for you? Seeing is believing. And I learned this from my Toyota days, called Gemba, right? Go and see. And it is one of the most powerful tools a leader can have. As I say, it's really just seeing is believing, really understanding the challenges that people are facing, the amount of effort it takes, the opportunities for errors and mistakes, the frustrations of the processes, the tools, the equipment that they're using. It's second to none. So that's where I would start. As far as the first couple of weeks, really just listening and learning. I know there's always a desire for quick action. And I'm a very action oriented person myself, and always have been as a leader. But I think in those situations where you've just moved in to lead a team, it's very important that you learn and understand the dynamics, the challenges, and the culture, before you go and start pulling some triggers or levers, because you can make a very big mistake if you don't fully understand what's behind everything.
When you think about those listen and learn moments and being there in person, can you give an example perhaps of one that was in your career or that you've seen with those that you've worked with, where just listening and learning in those first couple of weeks revealed something that other leaders had simply missed, and by understanding it and beginning to address it, you were able to start moving the needle quickly on turning the team in a better direction?
Well, one that comes to my mind, shortly after I joined an organization, it became very, very clear to me that the employees were very upset with a schedule change, a time start of shift change, and end of shift change. And obviously, this was understood. The existing leadership was aware that they were not happy with it, but they were pressing forward with this change anyways. And so very quickly, I was only there a matter of days. Actually, my first day on the job, I realized that this was a major problem. I started asking questions, much like I described a moment ago, trying to understand what are the challenges with this, why are people so upset about this, and I'm asking this of the employees themselves, and I'm asking similar questions to the leadership. And what became clear to me was that absolutely there was a need to change the shift times, but the approach that had been taken uh, was lacking. In other words, there was no communication to the employees, just a formal letter saying in 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, we're going to be changing your shifts. And it was a significant change in their shifts. So I do believe when you're implementing organizational change, that at times you don't want to be too quick to do this, but at times you do need to hit the pause button and stop. We're going in the wrong direction here. We need to regroup, and that's exactly what we did. So we paused. We communicated that we were stopping this change until further notice, so that we could listen and understand the concerns better. We held focus groups with the team members. We held discussions with the leadership team, and what became very clear was what we were trying to do, or the reason for this change, was not made clear. Uh, Once we started communicating the business need, and then also being open to changing the times that had been previously announced that would be more accommodating to the employees, as as long as they met the business need, we would be willing to do so. So we held those focus groups, got the team members involved, and eventually they understood why we were trying to do this. They understood that everybody wanted a different time, and you couldn't keep everybody happy. But we came to a not a compromise, I won't say it that way, but by involving them along the way, they better understood the business need, the challenges of trying to keep all employees happy, and they were much more receptive to the change once it was announced and communicated, and it went forward without any major problems at that point.
When you see organizations that have to make rapid changes for one reason or another, oftentimes regulatory influenced, they have to comply with some new standard. It's going to have a significant impact on daily job roles. So time is not on your side. Would you say communication is the most important element of change management, just making everybody aware of what's happening?
Absolutely, it is the biggest most important aspect of any change. And often the mistake is only doing the communication at the very beginning to say, "Hey, we're announcing this change," and then nobody ever hears anything again. The communication piece is critical, and there's different communication that needs to be made throughout the entire change. Change is going from point A to point B. The transition is that period in the middle between point A and point B. And often we just do that communication at the beginning. What's critical is the communication throughout the transition, and it's a different me- um, message that needs to be delivered along the way. So it's critical you use different media, different people, different approaches throughout that entire change management process. But absolutely, it's probably the biggest component in change.
And there's multiple internal communication styles depending on the size of the organization as well. So let's take the larger companies as an example. Very often, what happens, as I'm sure you know from your experience, there will be a large change readiness communication at a high level, and then it's left to the directors of their individual departments to then relay that message on in whatever form they feel is most fit. Could be a team meeting, could be a town hall, could be one to one. It's left to those to decide. And then there are other organizations where it is centralized and there is a communications team. Everything is done through email or large, company wide communications in sort of a one size fits all approach. I know it's situational and you can't say, well, which one is superior to the other. But let's take the example that you just talked about, where there's a substantial change to the actual workday and the implications of your working style. Do you think it is more important that the lowest level directors are able to communicate that clearly because they have a trust level with the direct reports who are doing the work? Or do you feel that when changes of that nature come out, it has to come from the most senior leaders because they're the ones who implemented it, and it needs to be seen at the same time by everybody through the organization?
Sure. I believe it has to be integrated, Brian. You've got to do both, quite frankly, right? So maybe they're offset in time by a little bit, but something like that, I do believe if it's a major change, has to be communicated top down to in most cases, as you say, it's situational, but if it's that big of an organizational change, it should come from the top to explain why and that it's happening, but not necessarily give all the details of how this impacts an individual team or individual employees. In order to do so, though, before that communication takes place, those lower level directors, as you say, need to be brought into the know. They need to be brought up to speed as to why this change is happening, what their role is, and answer any of their questions because they're the ones on the front line. So once the executive leaders make the communication, where do the employees go with all their questions? They go to those directors. So the last thing you want is a director going, I have no idea. I mean, this is from the top down. I can't answer your question. You want them to be able to face their employees confidently and be able to answer their questions and address their questions from their own perspective while supporting the upper level and the company level communication. So the two have to go hand in hand. There might be an offset in time slightly, but you need to do both, in my opinion.
So now let's take it down to the small business level. And for the purposes of this conversation, we'll say these are companies with, roughly a dozen employees, maybe even a little bit less than that. And perhaps there's some contractors involved in the work. So these are really, truly startups. The founder is so much the centerpiece of these organizations. They've set the strategy, they've set the purpose, they are the visible face of the product more often than not. And so when either changes happen or a change in strategy or any major announcements come, it's always presumed that has to come from that person. But as you start to grow, you certainly want to empower and deputize some of your other team members to be able to carry the same weight and the same gravity as you. How do you feel about this sort of change management within a startup culture? Does it always have to be the founder because that's what everybody signed up to be a part of, that team captain? Or do you feel like it's important for that founder to enable and empower the other key leaders of the organization to have just as much credibility in those moments?
Yeah, I don't believe that it's much different between the major large corporations and the small entrepreneurial businesses. I think it's important that within those organizations, the smaller organizations, there's different people that have different responsibilities. And I think it's just as important as in the large companies that you have different speakers, you have different people that are relaying the information and doing the communication. Even if it still starts at the top with the founder, they need to articulate their vision, articulate their strategy, or to change that strategy to the others, but allow their next levels down, if you will, to do those communications. It again for the same reason, so that people throughout the organization understand what's behind it, how it's going to impact them, what's changing, what's not changing, and for those other leaders to be able to competently answer the questions when they come up. I think a mistake that is often made in the smaller businesses is the lack of communication, or not necessarily looking at it holistically. That, well, we're a small little team, everybody should know this. It's not a secret, but you still need to be deliberate. You still need to have a plan on how you're going to communicate it, even if there's 12 people. I think the risk is almost even higher because your assumption is that everybody knows what's going on and why it's happening, and that isn't usually the case.
Have you found there is a preference among employees about how they want to be communicated to? I know email is a popular, easy go to because it can all be written out, but we're all flooded with emails, and sometimes it can get lost in your inbox. Sometimes you don't get to it that day, so the timing can be thrown off a bit. But then again, Zooms and town halls can get overwhelming as well. Have you noted any particular leadership, or excuse me, any particular communication style that you're seeing is more effective, perhaps now than it was in the past?
No, I don't think so, Brian. What I would say is my experience has been everybody has a different preferred method. And so again, going back to the previous question of is communication important? Yes, and this is another reason why it's important. And part of that communication plan is defining how you're going to communicate that message, a message, let's say, what media, and I'm stressing here multiple different types of media to be used. Because again, in my experience doing a lot of different communication for different changes over the years, everybody has a different preference. And so you can't just gravitate to one which might be yours because you're going to miss a large percentage of your employee base. So it's very important on these important communications that you use different media approaches to kind of put the, the net out there to catch as many people as you can with their preferred method of communication. So I think you have to,
When
yeah.
you Yeah, when you think about the communication timing as well, this can be unique on global teams. And I'm curious how you think about this when you're dealing with multiple time zones. So perhaps you have a team in Europe, you have a team in Asia, everybody's coming on and off a line at different times. You know that somebody has to go first. There's going to be a message that gets out there during somebody's working hours, but somebody else's team is asleep. How do you think about tackling that challenge of an international team and getting a message out, but doing it in a staggered way so that different regions pick up on it at different times? But you know someone's going to hear it first, and it may sort of leak in a way you didn't want it to in another region before you can get in front of it.
Well, first, I would I've tried to minimize that as much as possible. So sometimes that means very odd time of day in almost all the time zones to try to capture. So I would try to do it simultaneously as much as possible for the main reason you just said is that there will always be leaks, and then people get offended, they get upset because heard about it on the news or however way they found out about it from coworkers, etc. If that's not possible, then the next option is to look at um, choosing where best to communicate first. So often, I think a mistake that is made is if there's a headquarters or a head office, they get communicated first, but the impact might be in another time zone. So where the most where the biggest impact is, to me, should be the priority that gets communicated first. And then when you communicate to the other time zones, I think it's also important to, as part of the communication, but maybe a minor footnote somewhere, is to advise them why they're finding out after the main communication. People still get upset about it, but I think you have to, try to remind them and bring common sense into it to say, we've had to do it this way because, and most people will understand and accept that.
One of the most challenging aspects, I think, of leadership, especially as you become more senior, is the leadership bubble. We'll call it. It's harder and harder at times to get honest feedback because there are more layers between you and the individuals who might have the feedback. Let's begin assuming again we're in a larger company environment. How have you gone out of your way to ensure you're getting the feedback, even if directors maybe trying to filter it to you for one reason or another? Other than going to the people and obviously having those conversations, how do you keep sort of an always on feedback loop so that you're able to keep your ear to the ground and pick up on things that might be easy to deal with if you deal with them early, but will snowball if you don't?
Sure. I think the first thing, Brian, is that you've got to be approachable. You've got to be open. I try to be my natural self. I'm not different at work than I am at home, and vice versa. I try to be friendly, not friends, friendly with people that I work with. That helps both myself and them be approachable and comfortable with each other. So I think that's a prerequisite. That is a need. The technique that I found most effective to get feedback, first of all, I my habit was to ask for it frequently. So if I had a one-on-one with somebody, the one-on-one, if this was a direct report to me, the focus of the meeting, the one-on-one was on them. But if there was time at the end, I'd say, "Would you have any feedback for me?" And I would ask for some feedback. What can I do that would be more effective for you? How can I be a more effective leader for you, etc. The technique specifically that I found that works the best, especially as you mentioned, as you get into more in senior level, executive level positions, people seem to be reluctant to provide you with feedback. I ask for these three things. What should I continue to do? What should I start doing? And what should I stop doing? Very simple but powerful. I've tried the techniques of, can you give me some feedback of what my strengths are or what my weaknesses are, and you get very little. I think I attribute it to people don't want to offend you. They're afraid that maybe there's some repercussions or so forth. But when you ask what should I continue, start, and stop doing, it seems less intimidating, right? It's not a personal feedback thing. It's more of a just what should I start, stop, and continue doing. But these are powerful because continue to me gives you feedback as to what's working, what's effective for your team. And particularly if you've tried to make some changes, if it comes up in a continue basis, then you know you've been successful at implementing that change. Stop doing is very clear. That's what's irritating your team and frustrating. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to stop it, depending on what it is, but it certainly gives you an indication what they don't like. And then start, those are those gems of, wow, I never thought of that. I didn't realize they needed this level of support from me, or I never even thought that this would be something of interest to them. So I found that to be those three things to be extremely powerful and effective at getting feedback. And the last thing I'll share from a personal experience point of view, although I've always been open for feedback, I did hit a phase in my career, and I was in a high level position where I wasn't getting a lot of feedback from people, and I was very discouraged. And I was asking and asking and asking for feedback, even with the start, stop, and continue method. And one of my direct reports, who obviously felt comfortable giving me feedback, said, "Glenn, when you ask for the feedback, you ask a lot of questions afterwards, and it comes across as defensive." And I was shocked. I was hurt because to me, I wasn't being defensive. I was trying to understand. I was trying to understand why this wasn't working or why it was perceived this way, but I didn't intend it to be defensive. And this person went on to tell me, just say thank you. And if you want clarification, come back another day and say, I've been thinking, Brian, about this feedback you gave me. Could you give me an example where you see me do that or whatever? But they said, make sure you separated it. And I've never forgotten that. It was great advice. And you really do need to just take feedback, shake your head. Yep, great. Thank you very much.
It's great tips, great counsel. Now, let's shift a little bit to the conversation about generations in the workplace because feedback is actually where this shows up oftentimes the most. How people who perhaps are in their older years, they've been in the workforce 30, 40 years, they have a certain work style that includes how they take and give feedback. We have a younger generation that seems to both handle feedback differently and provide it differently. What are you seeing in the clients that you've worked with, or even the companies that you've been a leader of, about how you adapt your leadership style in a multi generational environment where you may have a team of people who range in age from their early 60s to their 20s. And somehow you have to find a way to get everybody to work on the same page, even though those styles, those generational differences can at times be very substantial.
That is a real challenge that many leaders are facing. My 2 cents worth on that is that you have to use situational leadership, and it's I don't think it's necessarily anything new per se, but maybe the as time goes on, the ratio of the different generations is obviously changing, and it will always continue to change. So maybe that's driving a higher level need for that situational leadership. But you have to, as a leader, you have to get to know each of your direct reports and understand what it is they need from you. And everybody is different, and understanding how you can best support them and how they want coaching and feedback. And the best way to do that is, and how do you get to know them, is just ask them, right? So I do a lot of executive coaching, and that's one of the things I always ask the people that I'm coaching at the end of the session. Do you have feedback for me? What can I do differently to make this more effective for you, so that I can change my and adapt my style and my approach depending on that individual person's preferences. Now, at the same time, you sometimes do need to be direct. You are the next level leader to that person, and sometimes people need direct feedback. So if it's significant, then you need to deliver that feedback, and it's less about the most effective way versus are you communicating that feedback and making it well understood. But that as an aside, regular growth and development feedback, get to know the person, understand what they need from you and how they need it from you, and use situational leadership to deliver that.
Is there any particular element of the workforce? And look, we hear a lot about the younger generation, right? We hear a lot about what millennials or Gen Z or what they want or what they don't want, and there seems to have been a lot of guesswork in the certainly the large corporate world, that there's assumptions about the way they want to work or the style they want to work or the kind of workplace they want to be in, and also often it seems that they're missing the mark. That there is a desire for mentorship, there is a desire for feedback, but perhaps the elder generation is just struggling to communicate effectively to the younger generation of up and coming leaders. And I know this is obviously a passion of yours as we try to develop leaders of the future. Have you seen a real change in that millennial and Gen Z generation about how we're developing those leaders? Or is it really the same way it's always been, but maybe technology is just changing the way people absorb that content? Or perhaps because we're in a slightly different environment and people think that they have a certain trajectory they have to follow because they've seen their peers doing it, that somehow that changes it. Is it always been this way, or is there something really different about our young generation here and how we're training them?
Well, I don't know if it's a case of how we're training them per se. I think there's a difference in preference of how they grow and develop. I think the younger generations want more of a coaching style development and feedback versus the traditional "I'm the boss, here's the direct, feedback." So I see that difference. Um, I think as I say, I think the bigger thing goes back to the leadership crisis, the leadership gap, where they're moving into these higher level positions at a much younger age, which is fine, which is great, but they haven't had the same opportunity to, I guess, ride shotgun with an experienced leader. So I think it's more so that they're missing the experience of others, for whatever reason, whether it's COVID or again the busy being busy aspect. or just the fact that so many of the more senior level leaders are leaving the workforce, and as I say, the younger generation is just moving up faster to higher level positions than their predecessors. When I look back on my career, um, perhaps I was very fortunate. I worked for some very reputable companies with very senior and very experienced leaders. And so I learned a lot through osmosis from just being able to be witness to major organizational change, major organizational crises, et cetera, where I wasn't maybe the major decision maker, but I was part of you know discussions, meetings, and fallout of these issues, and seeing how other leaders with much more experience than me made decisions, and how they approach things. And I think that's missing a lot in today's workforce. Again, I attribute it just to the fact of the busyness, as well as there's this they've moved into higher level positions so much younger, they've missed that opportunity. I'm not saying they're not capable, they're not intelligent. Absolutely they are. They just haven't had the luxury, I guess, as people like myself, where it took us a little bit longer to get into those positions, and as a result of that, we were able to witness and participate in things more indirectly than directly.
So there's no substitute for experience, but let's say you're a young leader and you find yourself in this spot. You have been thrust into a leadership position, perhaps earlier than you were ready. Maybe you even acknowledge that you weren't 100% ready, but here it is. What would your advice be to somebody who finds themselves in that situation? You can't just invent 5 years of experience, but there's probably some things that you can do. Perhaps it's the right time to reach out to a larger professional network and start gaining as much counsel as you can. Tell us a little bit about what your advice would be to somebody who finds themselves in that spot.
That's it exactly, Brian. I believe wholeheartedly in having a professional network. And I'm not talking about thousands of people. I'm talking about a small group of core professional network of people you trust, and respect. Um, and I don't think that's changed. That's something that I believed in and had throughout my career. Still leverage it today. And so when I was faced with challenges, or as I was faced with big decisions, I'd reach out to that handful of people. Usually they were in different organizations. They weren't in the same company as I was, which was even more beneficial because you get a different perspective. Not necessarily the right perspective, but they challenge your thinking, give you different things to think about. But I think it's very important that you have that network that you can reach out to, bounce some ideas off, get different experiences, and really think through things. And sometimes just the fact of talking to somebody else kind of turns on the light bulb for you, or you realize, oh, you know what, I'm going down the wrong path here. Let alone the feedback that you may get from those people as well. Very beneficial.
Do you think the same advice applies to those who are striking out on their own? One trend I have noticed is that I think in the past it was common for people to spend maybe as many as 20 or 25 years in a corporate environment learning their way through. And then at some point they've gained enough skills and they understand enough about a market that they can strike out on their own. And increasingly, the younger generation seems to feel compelled to do that much sooner. And again, perhaps before they've really matured all of their skills to do it. But let's say that you were fortunate enough to link up with a venture capital fund, or you've been financed in some other way. Your idea is starting to move forward, but you are still far too junior to really have the experience of going through all the ups and downs of a small business. Would you say the same applies with perhaps the leadership? Instead of looking for a mentorship group of corporate experts, that you may look for a mentorship group of entrepreneurial experts who have been down this road before?
Yes, I think it's very important that again, you have somebody you can bounce ideas off of, learn from, and I know it's going to sound uh, not so good here, but misery loves company. Just being able to talk to somebody else who's having the same challenge as you, even if they don't have the answers, or they haven't really lived through the experience yet, it goes a long way. It's when you start your own business, regardless of what age you are, it's tough and it's lonely. So just having that interaction with other people helps a lot, if nothing else, just from the misery loves company. But you'll also get some great advice, and you'll consider some other things that you otherwise would not have thought of yourself.
So, the last topic I want to touch on today is about managing your stress. Any executive position, whether you've started your own company or whether you are taking on somebody else's company, or you've simply had the opportunity to take on more responsibility in a large publicly traded company, it is natural to come with a lot more stress and strain than perhaps roles that you've had in the past. How do you counsel people to have a healthy amount of stress, the kind of stress that keeps you motivated, but not so much that it really begins to impact your ability to be an effective leader and perhaps maybe even affects your health?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword on this one. First and foremost, um, you know, when I've faced high levels of stress, and I've had some pretty, you know, overwhelming responsibilities, tasks, projects, and so forth in my career. And I would be lying to you if I said I wasn't stressed. But what I tried to practice was looking at the worst case. What's the worst possible thing that could happen here? And I must tell you, never in my career was I facing a life or death situation directly. I mean, I guess there could be some safety ramifications in some, but for the most part, looking at what is the worst case. And the worst case for me typically would come to I could lose my job, and then I'd back up from there. How likely is that? It's not very likely, and I just go back from there. So I would just look at it. What is the worst case, and I'd kind of talk myself off the ledge, if you will, and try to come back to more practical potential outcomes than the imagination side of things. The other thing, the other side of that sword, as I would say, is just looking after yourself. And I think this is what really concerns me when I see younger leaders today. They, it's the same old things we've all heard about. You got to get a good night's sleep. You've got to eat well. You've got to exercise, and you need other things to do than just to work. And I think a lot of people have the mindset, well, I'm just going to put all that stuff aside, even if it's subconsciously. I'm going to put that aside for the next few years so I can develop myself and grow in my career and so forth. Um, I've been fortunate. I haven't had any major health issues, but I would say I thought that for many years. I sacrificed myself and my family way too much, and I learned the hard way. Luckily, I didn't have any major consequences, but I learned the hard way, and I believe that it's very important that you balance those things, and it makes you a much happier person as well. And you know, what's the point in being successful in your career if you don't have a successful personal life and you don't have your health? There's just no point. You've got to have all three.
No question. Really appreciate the time today. I want to make sure folks can learn more about you and your leadership team and your company. So I know you have a website. Why don't you just talk with folks for a moment about where they can learn more about HP Leaders and some of the services that your organization offers?
Sure, thanks, Brian. We have three major services. One, we have various different levels of leadership development programs. We do executive coaching, and we also go into organizations and help them improve their culture or their operational performance within their organization. You can learn more by coming to hpleaders.com. That's hp-leaders.com.
Excellent. Glenn, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. It was a wide ranging conversation on leadership topics. I'm sure that our audience found it valuable, and hopefully, we'll have maybe the opportunity to bring you back at some point. I love to reach out to my audience to see what questions I missed. And if there are some key topics that would be worth bringing you back for and have a more in depth conversation on those, would love to do it. But thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian.
As always, I invite you to re listen to this episode. Glenn had a lot of great advice for aspiring leaders and entrepreneurs. I can't stress this enough that one of the objectives of this show is self improvement, it's virtual mentorship, it's bringing you voices that you might not otherwise be able to hear or get in touch with. This is one of those episodes that I think every young aspiring leader should listen to over and over again because you can't hear these lessons enough. Everything from our conversation about time management to the stress and pressure that comes with a leadership position and how you deal with that. And even though many of my listeners are in their earlier stages of their career, someday you're going to be dealing with a generation behind you that will likely have some of the same generational gaps that we discussed in this episode. So I strongly encourage you to re listen to this episode. In particular, I think it would be valuable to share this with anybody in your organization that you consider a high performing talent and somebody that you believe has potential to be an executive at some point. And just keep in mind, this can happen sooner than anybody thinks. We have an aging workforce. We have people looking on to their retirement years. They want to leave their positions to trusted current junior members of the team, but that may be happening earlier in the lifespan of a career for many people than it otherwise would have. So I hope that episodes like this give you a little inspiration if you're in that seat and you are the aspiring leader, or if you are a manager of, or director of, or CEO of a company. And you have aspiring leaders that you want to get prepared and get ready. An episode like this hopefully can go a long way. And of course, I strongly encourage you to look up Glenn. He shared some of his contact information. We will have his website and other relevant outreach information for Glenn available in the description of this episode, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll also have them in the description of our YouTube clips that promote this show, as well as on my website, brianjmatos.com, where you can find all of my episodes. And of course, we strongly encourage you to go back and listen to these over and over again. We love the podcast format for that reason. Unlike the radio or unlike a television interview, you hear it one time, you forget it. It's so valuable to have these episodes to go back to, and maybe even months from now, when a situation comes up in your life and something we talked about here today can be instrumental and helpful to you. So thank you all for listening to this episode. A reminder on how to get in touch with me. You can find me on email, info at brianjmatos.com. Send in your questions. If we can reach back out to some of our guests and pose your questions, we'll be happy to do that. We can also have folks like Glenn on for a future episode where we will just take your questions. You can find me on Twitter at Brian J. Matos. We post new episodes every weekend so that you can grab them there, and we try to promote those on Twitter first and foremost. I'm available on Facebook. You can find me, Brian.Matos is my personal page. You can also find the Brian J. Matos podcast fan page, and feel free to follow that as well to get exclusive content from this and every other episode. You will also find me on YouTube at Brian J. Matos Podcast. We don't post the full episodes there, we post promotional clips. But in case you didn't get the latest upload this week, or you just haven't had a chance to open your podcast channel or app of choice, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, and new clips will be posted there. And if you subscribe to my channel, you'll be the first to know when the new clips are available to preview the upcoming shows. And speaking of upcoming shows, we've got a couple of great ones for you. Next week, Bradley Sherman will be with us. He is a demographer who has a very unique view on our world in the United States and the demographic changes that we're going through, but also key insights to Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. We covered all of those topics, and we're going to share that interview with you next week. And there might be a few surprises in there, some topics that you might not have been thinking about in terms of demographics and the destiny that that's creating for us. Some of the demographic changes are already set in stone. Some they could change, or at least there's a potential opportunity for it. Tune in next week to find out the difference between the two. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to be joined by Lisa Patel. She is the CEO of Istesso, and that is a company that is on the cutting edge of treatments for autoimmune diseases and cancer. We can't wait to bring on Lisa to talk about some of the advancements in healthcare and the promise that many of these new technologies hold for millions of people around the world. And in a couple of weeks, Lucy Jung will join us. She is the co-founder of Charco, a medical innovation company focused on treatment for Parkinson's disease and other degenerative diseases. So next week, we're going to talk demographics, and the next two episodes after that, we're going to shift our focus a little bit to the cutting edge of healthcare treatments. and a lot of the promise that they hold. Thank you again for listening to this episode. A final reminder, you can find this episode and other content on brianjmatos.com. Follow me on social media, and I will get back to you if you email me info at brianjmatos.com. Thank you for listening again, and as always, don't forget to stay curious.